Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And one of the most common misconceptions out there is that Yamato is the only battleship that ever put to sea with 18-inch guns. She is rightly known as the battleship with the biggest guns, but that is because her guns were 460 millimeters or 18.1 inches. And this is a replica shell from Yamato, so you get an idea sitting next to a couple of curators for scale, what size that is, especially compared to a 16-inch shell here that's closer to curator size. So, can you tell us about some of the other ships that are developed with 18-inch guns?
So there were a number of different ships that were designed for 18-inch guns at various stages. As far as actually going to sea with 18-inch guns, the only one that, well, technically two classes of ship that go to sea with an 18-inch gun is what I sometimes refer to as the world's most heavily armed aircraft carrier, HMS Furious. She was originally designed to carry a pair of 18-inch guns in two single turrets, one fore, one aft. But by the time she was under construction, they already realized this was a thoroughly impractical and stupid thing to do because they put Glorious and Courageous into service with twin 15s. And let's just say firing those guns was not doing pleasant things to their whole structure. Mm-hmm. So they decided to create, technically speaking, the world's first hybrid carrier by sticking a flight deck on the forward part of Furious and keeping the aft with the 18-inch gun. So she sailed around like that for a bit, and the forward gun and the spare barrel that was also manufactured were diverted to a pair of monitors, mm-hmm. which again had been constructed originally with slightly smaller gun turrets, but they thought, well, we've got these things, they're pretty good for shore bombardment, so we'll install them on there. And then when Furious was reconfigured to have a fore and an aft flight deck before they took the superstructure away, they also took that gun barrel and put it on a third monitor, so some of the Lord Clives, except that it was questionable whether an 18-inch 40 caliber gun would work on something the size of Furious. Sticking it on a monitor, there was absolutely no way you were actually going to get that to work as a turreted weapon. So they stuck it as a fixed sideways pointing gun, so you could just elevate it.
So you're maneuvering the whole ship to aim the gun?
Yes. Yeah, and there's all sorts of hilarity with that monitor that monitor series, because again, unlike Furious, it's far too small to have a full hoist system to move the shell and the charges around. There's no space in there for the hoist system with the depth of the ship that they've got. So what they ended up doing was they ended up installing a little light railway on the fantail where they had the gun installed. So the shells and the charges were slightly further forward on the ship, and then they would have to put them on this little light railway that had a circular track that ran around the gun. So if you wanted to load the gun, you had a little train show up with the charges and shells.
So you're talking about explosives out on the main deck, not armored or protected in any way.
Yep. So if you were, and they used it for shore bombardment, but that was an 18-inch 40, so a relatively short barrel weapon, mm-hmm. as all things considered. The British did have another 18-inch gun design, which was an 18-inch 45, which they designed for the N3 class battleships in the 1920s.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So our first experiences with 18-inch guns are not great because they're trying to put them on really small ships instead of full-size capital ships. So now the British design an actual capital ship to take an 18-inch gun.
Yeah, so everybody is kind of escalating in the latter part of the World War I period, the 1910s. You've gone from 12-inch at the beginning of the 1910s. The British have gone in 1.5-inch increments from 12 to 13.5 to 15. The US has gone in 2-inch increments from 12 to 14, and now they're looking at 16. Mm-hmm. So by the British standards, they should be looking at a 16.5-inch gun. The Germans were looking at a 16.5-inch gun, but kind of like they tried to do with Dreadnought and jump everybody, they initially, when they started looking at what would become the G3 and N3 mm-hmm. battlecruiser battleship designs, they were initially looking at them all having 18-inch guns, which is two increments of 1.5 inches. But they were limited by the size of dockyards that they had overseas. They actually had big enough dockyards in the UK to have an 18-inch battlecruiser and an 18-inch battleship, but because they had an empire, mm-hmm. the battleship obviously being slower would be shorter, so that was fine, but they tried their hardest and they couldn't get an 18-inch gun battlecruiser design that would fit. So they had downgraded it to the 16.5-inch gun briefly, which was the logical increment for the way the British were doing things. And even that didn't really work, so they eventually accepted the G3 design, which had 16-inch guns, which is then how, when you get to the Washington Treaty, everyone agrees that the 16-inch is going to be the limit, because you've got Nagato and the Nagato class, the Colorado class, are both building with 16-inch guns, and the South Dakotas and Lexingtons are going to have 16-inch, the Tosas and Amagis are going to have 16-inch, the G3s are going to have 16-inch, the M3s are the outlier in that generation in that they're the only 18-inch design that survives. But everyone kind of goes, yeah, we're just going to quietly ignore that and accept that 16 is now the standard caliber. And that's kind of, the 18-inch gun dies a death, because now 16-inch is the accepted maximum caliber for the treaty period. Although there's plenty of indication, certainly the Japanese were looking at 18-inch guns for their follow-on battleships.
Right, number 13 class, yeah.
Yeah, the US seemed to be going for more guns. The 1920 South Dakotas having 12 16-inch 50s. As you get to the other end of the treaty era, when the treaty system is collapsing, people start looking at 18-inch guns again. So the Germans inevitably end up looking at the 18-inch gun during their rearmament process, although they never get around to anything more than a paper design.
Okay.
The 18-inch gun keeps recurring in American designs, though. Some of the first draft designs of what will eventually become Iowa have 18-inch guns, and then once that gets shot down, and they end up settling on first reusing the 16-inch 50s that they've got from the Lexingtons and South Dakotas in the 1920s. Then there's the whole screw-up between Buell and Bew ships with the turret design, so they have to design the Mark 7s, which is obviously what the ship has now. And then they get into designing the Montanas, so the question then comes back again, well, now we've got the bigger, slower battleship, and they look at some of the initial sketch designs that would eventually have become Iowa, and they go, oh, well, but one of these designs had the 18-inch gun, so maybe we can have an 18-inch gun on Montana. And there are sketches of twin and triple 18-inch guns from the US design bureaus, but that gets shot down again quite quickly. There's some discussion about a 16-inch 56 caliber weapon, which they reckoned would have even better penetration, because it would be a 56 caliber weapon as opposed to a sub 50 caliber weapon, and being a 16-inch gun, you could fit more of them on. And so as a result, you ended up with a test gun, which still exists in some way, shape or form, and Yamato was left as the only World War II era capital ship that went to sea with the 18-inch guns.
And the only ship actually armored against 18-inch guns.
To a certain degree, yes. Yeah.
As much as you can armor a floating object against a projectile that size.
One of the big disadvantages of the 18-inch gun, which people sometimes don't sometimes recognize, because they think, oh, well, a 14-inch, a 16-inch is better than a 14-inch, so an 18-inch must be better than a 16-inch, and a 20-inch would be even better than that, is that with the advances in technology when it comes to hoists and loading mechanisms, etc., roughly speaking, the maximum rate of fire that a battleship can sustain stays about the same, whether they've got a 12-inch or 14-inch or a 16-inch gun. But when you get to the 18-inch, the sheer size, because of course you've got the square cube law, it might only be 2 inches more, but as people can see, the size difference and the mass difference is quite considerable. It turns out that actually trying to get these things to load is quite difficult with the technology they have available, so the actual maximum rate of fire drops. And this is one of the other considerations, especially with the US, which constantly looks at 18-inch guns and keeps rejecting them, is that you've got fewer guns for a given size of hull, but also those guns will have a slower rate of fire. Now, technically speaking, everybody can still fire at least one round a minute, which is roughly what you would be firing in battle. But that's kind of, in some ways, a little bit of a false idea, because, as we said, these things, the 16-inch shells can be fired theoretically around about 2 rounds a minute. But with the confusion of wartime and the fact it's not a drill, the ship's pitching and rolling, it's all sorts of weathers, and you've got to make constant corrections because the enemy's not sailing in a lovely straight line most of the time. All of that drops your rate of fire, and you get this approximately 1 round a minute that you see in a lot of naval battles. Whereas with the 18-inch gun, that 1 round a minute, or maybe 1.5 rounds a minute, is kind of the ideal, the on trials fire rate. So if you were to fire an 18-inch gun on anything that's not Yamato size or bigger, you'd probably actually end up with a rate of fire that drops below 1 round a minute, which actually is going to mean that your enemy is able to send more salvos out at you, and if there's like a Montana with more guns, which exponentially increases the chance of you getting hit. And yes, your belt might protect you, but when you're talking about either a 16-inch or an 18-inch shell, if one of these arrives on board, it's bad news even if it doesn't go anywhere near your belt.
Yeah, it's a 500-pound weight difference, but getting hit by 2,700 pounds hurts nearly as much as getting hit by 3,200 pounds.
Well, I mean, I know it's the classic thing, but look at the voyage of Bismarck. Ignoring Hood for a moment because that's a whole separate thing. But if you look at the ships that survived Denmark Strait, a 15-inch shell that went nowhere near Prince of Wales's citadel was still able to wipe out most of her command crew. And that didn't even explode. That was just the passage of the shell. So, a 16 or an 18-inch shell, slightly more destructive from that perspective. Prince of Wales, of course, hits Bismarck in the bow, amongst other places, causes that massive fuel leak. Again, not an area that will be protected by all or nothing armour particularly. And that also ended up causing it was either that hit or another hit that ended up causing flooding that flooded some of the boiler rooms. Again, not a citadel hit, but the shell was destructive enough. So all of these things can impede your combat performance without penetrating the citadel, which is why you really want to hit, as is often said in a lot of history books, you want to hit first and keep hitting, because that first hit almost, not quite, but almost anywhere on a battleship will degrade your performance enough that that'll give you an advantage, which might lead to you scoring the second and the third and the fourth hit before your enemy gets a hit onto you, at which point, this thing might do fantastic amounts of damage if it hits, but if you've only got 9 rounds out in the time that your opponent might have gotten 24, statistically speaking, they're the ones who are likely to start knocking down your combat capability.
So that has been Drachinifel on the 18-inch gun and why it never really caught on, but why it was on more ships than you've probably ever heard of. So what do you think? Was the 18-inch gun worth it? Should more battleships have been built that had guns of that size? Or should they have stayed with 16-inch guns or even gone smaller for higher rates of fire? Let us know in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to continue donating to support the museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.
Bye. You must say that in your sleep.